Nouvelle Vague redirects here. For the music group of the same name, see Nouvelle Vague. For other meanings, see Nouvelle Vague. The New Wave is a blanket term coined by critics for a group of French filmmakers of the late 1950s and 1960s. Although never a formally organized movement, the New Wave filmmakers were linked by their self-conscious rejection of the literary period pieces being made in France and written by novelists, along with their spirit of youthful iconoclasm, the desire to shoot more current social issues on location, and their intention of experimenting with the film form. New Wave is an example of European art cinema. Many also engaged in their work with the social and political upheavals of their era, making their radical experiments with editing, visual style and narrative part of a general break with the conservative paradigm. Using portable equipment and requiring little or no setup time, the New Wave way of filmmaking presented a documentary style. The films exhibited direct sounds on film stock that required less light. Filming techniques included fragmented, discontinuous editing, and long takes. The combination of objective realism, subjective realism, and authorial commentary created a narrative ambiguity in the sense that questions that arise in a film are not answered in the end. Origins of the movement. Alexandra Struck's manifesto, The Birth of a New Avant-Garde. The Camera Stylo, published in L'Écran on 30 March 1948, outlined some of the ideas that were later expanded upon by François Truffaut and the Cahiers du Cinéma. It argues that cinema was in the process of becoming a new means of expression on the same level as painting and the novel, a form in which an artist can express his thoughts, however abstract they may be, or translate his obsessions exactly as he does in the contemporary essay or novel. This is why I would like to call this new age of cinema the age of the camera stylo. Some of the most prominent pioneers among the group, including François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Éric Rohmer, Claude Chabrol, and Jacques Rivette, began as critics for the famous film magazine Cahiers du Cinéma. Cahiers co-founder and theorist André Bazin was a prominent source of influence for the movement. By means of criticism and editorialization, they laid the groundwork for a set of concepts, revolutionary at the time, which the American film critic Andrew Sarris called auteur theory. Cahiers du Cinéma writers critiqued the classic, tradition of quality, style of French cinema. Notable among these was François Truffaut in his manifesto-like article, Une certaine tendance du cinéma français. Bazin and Henry Langlois, founder and curator of the Cinémathèque Française, were the dual father figures of the movement. These men of cinema valued the expression of the director's personal vision in both the film's style and script. Truffaut also credits the American director Maurice Engel and his film Little Fugitive with helping to start the French New Wave, when he said, "Our French New Wave would never have come into being if it hadn't been for the young American Maurice Engel who showed us the way to independent production with fine movie." The auteur theory holds that the director is the author of his movies, with a personal signature visible from film to film. They praised movies by Jean Renoir and Jean Vigo, and made then radical cases for the artistic distinction and greatness of Hollywood studio directors such as Orson Welles, John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock and Nicholas Ray. The beginning of the New Wave was to some extent an exercise by the Cahiers writers in applying this philosophy to the world by directing movies themselves. Apart from the role that films by Jean Rouch have played in the movement, Chabrol's Le Beau Serge is traditionally credited as the first New Wave feature. Truffaut, with the 400 Blows, and Godard, with Breathless, had unexpected international successes, both critical and financial, that turned the world's attention to the activities of the New Wave and enabled the movement to flourish. Part of their technique was to portray characters not readily labeled as protagonists in the classic sense of audience identification. The auteurs of this era owe their popularity to the support they received with their youthful audience. Most of these directors were born in the 1930s and grew up in Paris, relating to how their viewers might be experiencing life, with high concentration in fashion, urban professional life, and all-night parties. The life of France's youth was being exquisitely captured. The French New Wave was popular roughly between 1958 and 1964, although New Wave work existed as late as 1973. The socio-economic forces at play shortly after World War II strongly influenced the movement. Politically and financially drained, France tended to fall back on the old popular pre-war traditions. One such tradition was straight narrative cinemas, specifically classical French film. The movement has its roots in rebellion against the reliance on past forms, criticizing in particular the way these forms could force the audience to submit to a dictatorial plotline. They were especially against the French cinema of quality, the type of high-minded, literary period films held in esteem at French film festivals, often regarded as untouchable by criticism. New Wave critics and directors studied the work of Western classics and applied new avant-garde stylistic direction. The low-budget approach helped filmmakers get at the essential art form and find what was, to them, a much more comfortable and contemporary form of production. Charlie Chaplin, Alfred Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Howard Hawks, John Ford, and many other forward-thinking film directors were held up in admiration, while standard Hollywood films bound by traditional narrative flow were strongly criticized. French New Wave might be influenced by Italian neorealism and classical Hollywood cinema. In a 1961 interview, Truffaut said that the New Wave is neither a movement, nor a school, nor a group. It's a quality, and in December 1962 published a list of 162 film directors who had made their feature film debut since 1959. Many of these directors, such as Edmond de Gabra and Henri Zafiritis, were not as successful or enduring as the well-known members of the New Wave and today would not be considered part of it. Shortly after Truffaut's published list appeared, Godard publicly declared that the New Wave was more exclusive and included only Truffaut, Chabrol, Rivette, Roma and himself, stating that his was the nucleus of the movement. Godard also acknowledged filmmakers such as Resnais, Astruc, Varda and Demy as esteemed contemporaries, but said that they represented their own fund of culture, and were separate from the New Wave. Many of the directors associated with the New Wave continued and continue to make films into the 21st century. Film techniques. The movies featured unprecedented methods of expression, such as long tracking shots. Also, these movies featured existential themes, such as stressing the individual and the acceptance of the absurdity of human existence. Filled with irony and sarcasm, the films also tend to reference other films. Many of the French New Wave films were produced on tight budgets, often shot in a friend's apartment or yard, using the director's friends as the cast and crew. Directors were also forced to improvise with equipment. The cost of film was also a major concern, thus, efforts to save film turned into stylistic innovations. For example, in Jean-Louis Godard's Breathless, after being told the film was too long and he must cut it down to 1 hour and a half, he decided to remove several scenes from the feature using jump cuts, as they were filmed in one long take. Parts that did not work were simply cut from the middle of the take, a practical decision and also a purposeful stylistic one. The cinematic stylings of French New Wave brought a fresh look to cinema with improvised dialogue, rapid changes of scene, and shots that broke the common 180 degrees axis of camera movement. In many films of the French New Wave, the camera was used not to mesmerize the audience with elaborate narrative and illusory images, but rather to play with audience expectations. Godard was arguably the movement's most influential figure. His method of filmmaking, often used to shock and awe audiences out of passivity, was abnormally bold and direct. As a result of his techniques, he is an early example of a director who was accused of having contempt for his audience. His stylistic approach can be seen as a desperate struggle against the mainstream cinema of the time, or a degrading attack on the viewer's supposed naivety. Either way, the challenging awareness represented by this movement remains in cinema today. Effects that now seem either trite or commonplace, such as a character stepping out of their role in order to address the audience directly, were radically innovative at the time. Classic French cinema adhered to the principles of strong narrative, creating what Godard described as an oppressive indeterministic aesthetic of plot. In contrast, New Wave filmmakers made no attempts to suspend the viewer's disbelief. In fact, they took steps to constantly remind the viewer that a film is just a sequence of moving images, no matter how clever the use of light and shadow. The result is a set of oddly disjointed scenes without attempt at unity, or an actor whose character changes from one scene to the next, or sets in, which onlookers accidentally make their way onto camera along with extras, who in fact were hired to do just the same. At the heart of New Wave technique is the issue of money and production value. In the context of social and economic troubles of a post-World War II France, filmmakers sought low-budget alternatives to the usual production methods, and were inspired by the generation of Italian neo-realists before them. Half necessity and half vision, New Wave directors used all that they had available to channel their artistic visions directly to the theatre. Finally, the French New Wave, as the European modern cinema, is focused on the technique as style itself. A French New Wave filmmaker is first of all an author who shows in its film his own eye on the world. On the other hand, the film as the object of knowledge challenges the usual transitivity on which all the other cinema was based, undoing its cornerstones: space and time continuity, narrative and grammatical logics, the self-evidence of the represented worlds. In this way the filmmaker passes the essay attitude, thinking, in a novelist way, on his own way to do essays. Left Bank. The Left Bank, or Rive Gauche group, is a contingent of filmmakers associated with the French New Wave, first identified as such by Richard Roud. The corresponding Right Bank group is constituted of the more famous and financially successful New Wave directors associated with Cahiers du Cinéma. Unlike the Cahiers, these directors were older and less movie-crazed. They tended to see cinema akin to other arts, such as literature. However, they were similar to the New Wave directors in that they practiced cinematic modernism. Their emergence also came in the 1950s, and they also benefited from the youthful audience. The two groups, however, were not in opposition. Cahiers du Cinéma advocated left-bank cinema. Left-bank directors include Chris Marker, Alan Resnais, and Agnes Varda. Roud described the distinctive fondness for a kind of bohemian life and an impatience with the conformity of the right bank, a high degree of involvement in literature and the plastic arts, and a consequent interest in experimental filmmaking, as well as an identification with the political left. The filmmakers tended to collaborate with one another. Jean-Pierre Melville, Alan Robbe-Grillet, and Marguerite Duras are also associated with the group. The Nouveau Roman movement in literature was also a strong element of the left bank style, with authors contributing to many of the films. Left bank films include La Pointe Courte, Hiroshima Mon Amour, La Jetée, Last Year at Marienbad, and Trans-European Express. Influential names in the New Wave: Cahiers du Cinéma directors Claude Chabrol, Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivette, Éric Rohmer, François Truffaut. Left bank directors Henri Colpi, Jacques Demy, Chris Marker, Alan Resnais, Agnes Varda. Other directors associated with the movement are the contributors Raoul Coutard, cinematographer; Henri Decker, cinematographer; André Weinfeld, cinematographer; Georges Delerue, composer; Paul Gegauf, screenwriter; Michel Legrand, composer; Marilu Parolini, photographer, screenwriter; Suzanne Schiffman, screenwriter. Actors and actresses. Theoretical influences: Alexander Struck, André Bizine, Robert Bresson, John Cassavetes, Henry Longlua, Roger Lienhardt. Theoretical followers Jonathan Rosenbaum, Andrew Saris,